Assalamu alaikum. So, returning back to our detailed linguistic analysis of chapter 2, verse 260, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 260, concerning the story of Ibrahim when he said to Allah, Arini kayfa tuhyi al-mawta. So, today we're going to offer somewhat of a conclusion, but I don't think in anything that we study from the Quran, I don't think there's ever a conclusion because only Allah knows the true depth of His words. So, we're going to offer somewhat of a conclusion to tie together everything that we already talked about. But let's read the verse again to bring back to mind where we're at. So he says, وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّي أَرِنِي كَيْفَ تُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى. And when Ibrahim said, my Lord, show me how you give life to al-mawta. So we said al-mawta more likely is referring to those not physically dead, but spiritually dead. Although that's not 100% clear in every verse, but there are verses that seem to indicate that the plural al-mawta are spiritually dead, and the plural amwat are physically, or is just a more general term for those that have died. So he says, Arini kayfa tuhyi al-mawta. Show me how you give life to al-mawta. Qala awalam tu'min. He said, do you not believe or do you not have faith? Qala bala walakin liyatma'inna qalbi. He said, certainly, but I want my heart to feel tranquil. قال فخذ أربعة من الطير فصرهن إليك. He said, then take 4 birds, فصرهن إليك, cause them to incline to you. So in Arabic, when we say surtu ila al-amr, that I surtu to something, to some matter, it means miltu ilay. It means I have inclined to it. فصرهن إليك. So cause them to incline to you. So perhaps meaning take time to train them so that they'll respond to your call. And that's why in the end of the verse, he's going to say, then call them, because you train them to respond to your call. ثُمَّ جَعَلْ عَلَى كُلِّ جَبَلٍ مِّنْهُنَّ جُزْءًا. Then place upon every mountain a portion of them. And I think this is where the part of the verse where some people get confused in thinking that he had to slaughter them because they're only thinking in terms of physical death. But if you look at the word juz', because they might think, how is it that you can place upon every mountain a portion of them, a juz'a of them, if you don't slaughter them? Well, if we go to this verse in 1544. So in 1544, he's talking about Jahannam, right? So let's read what he says here, and I think this will shed light on this word juz'a, which means a part. So 1544, he says, وَإِنَّ جَهَنَّمَ لَمَوْعِدُهُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. And Jahannam certainly is their promised time and place, all of them. لَهَا سَبْعَةُ أَبْوَابٍ. It has 7 doors. لِكُلِّ بَابٍ مِّنْهُمْ جُزْءٌ مَقْسُومٌ. For every door from amongst them, amongst those people, are جُزْءٌ مَقْسُومٌ. A juz', a portion that has been divided for that door. So there are 7 doors, and every door has a portion, has a juz'. So the word juz' in and of itself doesn't indicate that you take one thing and you divide that one thing. It can also indicate that you have a whole group of things, and when you portion that group out into different portions, each portion is called a juz'. Okay? So going from that to what he told Ibrahim, cause them to incline to you, then place upon every mountain juz'an, a portion, doesn't necessarily mean that he had to take the birds and slaughter them and cut them up. It just means he had to separate them and put some of them on some mountains and some of them on others. So that's one point. And then he said, ثُمَّ دَعُهُنَّ, and then call them, يَأْتِينَكَ سَعْيًا, they will come to you running, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَزِيزٌ حَكِيمٌ, and know that Allah is mighty and wise. Now, why was this the answer to show me how you give life to al-mawta? Well, one suggestion I would like to give in this video today is that it relates back to 257, verse 257. So if you watch the other videos, the other 3 videos that we did talking about this verse, you remember that I said this whole context fits together, because 258, he's having an argument or a debate with someone about life and death. 259, we're told the story of the person that passed by a town and said, how would Allah bring this to life after its death? And then in 260, that's when Allah is relating the story of Ibrahim, where he says, show me how you give life to al-mawta. So the whole context, 258, 259, 250, or 260, is all about life and death. And then if you go back to 255, it's also referring to life because it says Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayy al-qayyum. Allah, there is no God except for He, al-hayy, the living, al-qayyum, the one who subsists and sustains everything. So from 255 all the way up to 260 is all about life and death, right? So it's not a far stretch then to think that 257 has something to do with that as well. And what does 257 say? Allahu waliyyu alladhina amanu yukhrijuhum min adh-dhulumati ila nur. Allah is the wali, the guardian. We talked about in other videos the meaning of the word wali. So wali is more specifically like a guardian or a caretaker or someone that's directing your affairs. So Allah is the wali of those who have believed. He takes them out from many forms of darkness to light. So what does this have to do with life and death and with Ibrahim's question and the answer that was given, which was train them to incline to you and to come to your call, then place some of them on different mountains and then call them. So this is so beautiful because a temporary, at least, conclusion that we can come to from this, and we can always study more and more. But if you connect the ideas together and the fact that this whole context deals with life and death, one interesting conclusion that we can come to is that the way that Allah gives life to the dead is by taking them from darkness to light. Allah is the wali of those who have believed. He takes them from darkness to light. That's how He gives life to the dead. And perhaps that's what part of what this answer to Ibrahim means, because we are always gravitated towards our caretaker. So when Ibrahim takes care of them and trains them and makes them inclined to Him, where they will come to Him when He calls them, He's like their caretaker. He's like their wali. He's taking care of them and He's directing their affairs. And so when He calls them, they will come to Him. Allah is the wali of those who have believed. He takes them from darkness to light. So we always go back to our guardian and our caretaker. So Allah, when He calls us to take us from darkness to light, we respond. We go towards the light. We are attracted to the light, to illumination, to enlightenment, to knowledge, right? So this is how Allah gives life to the dead, is by taking them from darkness to light. Now, whenever we study something in the Quran and we come up with a theory to explain it, whether that's from the context, whether that's from the meaning of some Arabic words, however we figure that theory out, right? What we want to do is to ensure that it's a solid theory. And again, at the end of the day, only Allah knows, right? But to ensure that it's a solid theory and we can say this theory is substantial and it's supported, what we want to do is we want to tie it with other places in the Quran and see if it all fits together. Because if it doesn't fit together, as Allah said, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ, have they not contemplate, or do they not contemplate the Quran? وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Had it been from other than Allah, they would have found therein many discrepancies. So whenever we have a theory about the meaning of a verse, a meaning of a word, or whatever it might be, we want to tie that together with other places in the Quran to ensure there's no discrepancies. And if it fits with other places in the Quran, then we can say this is probably a solid theory. So this theory that what's being referred to here of how Allah gives life to the dead is by taking them to darkness, from darkness to light, let's see if we can look somewhere else to support that. So if we go to chapter 6, we find something very interesting. So remember, this is in the context of Ibrahim, right? So when we go to chapter 6, verse 75, we find something very interesting. It says, وَكَذَلِكَ نُرِي إِبْرَاهِيمَ مَلَكُوتَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. And likewise do we show Ibrahim the dominions of the heavens and the earth, وَلِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ, and so that he might be of those who have certainty. Look at the correlation between the verses. In Al-Baqarah it says, وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي, I want my heart to feel tranquil. Here he says he shows him the dominions of the heavens and the earth, وَلِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ, so he can be amongst those who have certainty, right? Now what's the next verse? Verse 76, 676. فَلَمَّا جَنَّ عَلَيْهِ اللَّيْلُ رَأَى كَوْكَبًا. when the night covered him, janna alayhi, concealed or covered him, ra'a kawkaba, he saw a kawkab, maybe a star or a planet. So what's interesting about that is, look how he goes from wanting Ibrahim to be of those who have certainty. Where does Ibrahim's journey start from? It starts from the darkness. فَلَمَّا جَنَّ عَلَيْهِ اللَّيْلُ, right? When the night covered him. He saw a kawkab. قَالَ هَذَا رَبِّي, he said, this is my Lord. فَلَمَّا أَفَلَ قَالَ لَا أُحِبُّ الْآفِلِينَ, but when it set, he said, I don't like those that set. The next verse, فَلَمَّا رَأَى الْقَمَرَ بَازِغًا قَالَ هَذَا رَبِّي. He goes through a similar experience. He sees the moon coming out prominently, and he said, this is my Lord. But notice, it starts in the darkness. It starts in the night, when the night covers him. Not just in the night, janna alayhi, like it envelops him. So he's in complete darkness, and he's looking for these sources of light. See how he goes from death to life spiritually. He sees the moon. And then in 78, فَلَمَّا رَأَى الشَّمْسَ بَازِغَةً قَالَ هَذَا رَبِّي. When he saw the sun rising or coming out prominently, he said, this is my Lord. And in each time, he concluded that no, that wasn't the case. But my point is, he starts from darkness and he looks for these sources of light. And that's how he's led to Allah, right? So from darkness to light. Now, to support that theory even more, what is the very first verse of this chapter, which is chapter 6? The very first verse of this chapter that has within it Ibrahim, the night covering him, and then him seeing these sources of light. And he's also the person that asked Allah to show him how he gives life to the dead, which right before that is talking about Allah taking those who have believed from darkness to light. So what is the very first verse of chapter 6 that this story is in, where he's looking for these sources of light? The very first verse. Alhamdulillahi alladhi khalaqa as-samawati wal-ard. All praise belongs to Allah who created the heavens and the earth. وَجَعَلَ الظُّلُمَاتِ وَالنُّورِ. And he made the darknesses and the light. That's what chapter 6 starts with. And then you flip right over to 76, and it talks about Ibrahim, the night covering him, and him looking for these sources of light. Another thing that supports this theory is staying right within chapter 6 that has the story of Ibrahim, that the first verse is talking about darkness and light. We find in verse 59 where it says, وَعِنْدَهُ مَفَاتِحُ الْغَيْبِ لَا يَعْلَمُهَا إِلَّا هُ. And with him is the keys of the unseen, which none knows except for he. وَيَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ. And he knows what's in the land and the sea. وَمَا تَسْقُطُ مِنْ وَرَقَةٍ إِلَّا يَعْلَمُهَا. And no leaf falls except that he knows it. وَلَا حَبَّةٍ فِي ظُلُمَاتِ الْأَرْضِ. Nor any seed in the darknesses of the earth. So the life of the seed starts in the darknesses of the earth, and it goes up to the surface towards the light. Just like when Ibrahim, this is in verse 59. So just like when Ibrahim, a few verses later in verse 76, starts off in the darkness and is going towards the light. This is how Allah takes from death, or gives life to the dead, is by taking from darkness to light. Also in verse 122 of chapter 6, look at how all these things go together. In verse 122 of chapter 6, he says, أَوَمَنْ كَانَ مَيْتًا فَأَحْيَيْنَاهُ. Or then is the one who was dead, and we gave him life. وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُ نُورًا يَمْشِي بِهِ فِي النَّاسِ. And we made for him a light by which he walks amongst people. This is also in chapter 6, right? So all of these support the theory that how Allah gives life to the dead is by taking them from darkness to light. And then finally, one last verse I want to mention to support this is in chapter 39. So in chapter 39, when he's talking about the birth process and people, us as human beings being in the wombs of our mothers, look what he says. يَخْلُقُكُمْ فِي بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ. He creates you in the wombs of your mothers. خَلْقًا مِنْ بَعْدِ خَلْقٍ. Creation after creation. فِي ظُلُمَاتٍ ثَلَاثٍ. In 3 forms of darkness. So in the wombs of your mother, this is 39:6. He refers to that being in 3 forms of darkness. So putting all that together, I think, supports the idea that this context, chapter 2, verse 260, and when you go before it to 257, that talks about Allah taking those who believe from darkness to light, that is part of the answer to Ibrahim in terms of show me how you give life to the dead. And Allah knows best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.